Police were investigating the disappearance of a couple from a frat party. The last time they were seen, they were in the back of a stranger's car, and they both looked very scared. After tracing the license plate of this car, police are now hot on the heels of a couple named Charlene and Gerald Gallego, and they've just learned that Gerald Gallego is a sick and twisted man. So could the police be on the right tracks? Could Gerald Gallego have done something to this missing couple? So today's video is part 2 of the sex slave murders. If you haven't caught part 1, I uploaded it yesterday. I'll link it up here in the eye so you can go and catch up with that one and then come here for this one afterwards. Quickly before we carry on with the case, I do just want to thank our sponsors for making this video possible, Magellan TV. You guys already know how much I love documentary streaming service Magellan TV. They upload new documentaries every single week, so I'm never bored. Literally between 15 and 20 hours of new content goes on their website every single week, and you think I can't find anything to watch on there? I'm always finding new things to watch on there. I've got a couple of recommendations actually that I watched recently that I wanted to tell you guys about. The first one is The Real Exorcist. Now hear me out, because I don't know if I really believe in all this kind of stuff. This documentary series basically follows this exorcist, and he's like banishing demons and evil spirits out of these people. And from my point of view, because I don't know if I believe in that kind of stuff, it's so interesting. I think no matter what you believe, it would be interesting to watch people do that, you know? Another documentary that I really liked on there recently was Confessions of an Alien Abductee. And this documentary basically follows this alien abductee support group and helpline. It's all UK based, and it's about these people that go and meet with people that have been abducted and experimented on by aliens, and they all come together to share their experiences. It's so interesting. Magellan TV is completely ad-free, so there's no interruptions. You can watch on pretty much any device you have, and like I said, they upload new documentaries every single week, so what are you waiting for? And they're very kindly offering you guys a 1-month free trial when you click the link down below in the description of this video. Thanks again to Magellan TV for sponsoring this video. Now before we get into it, I do just want to give the same content warnings that I gave in part 1. There's quite a lot of dark themes in this video, so if any of the following are things that you don't think you can handle right now, please do click out of the video. In this video, there will be themes of forced abortion, sick, incest, domestic violence, sexual assault, and rape. Like I said, if any of that is something that you don't want to hear right now, that's absolutely fine. Please look after yourself before you watch any kind of true crime video. I'm sure I'll see you again at some other point with a different video. Now, with all that being said, let's just jump into the case. So where we left off in the last part, police had just learned that Gerald Gallego was a not very nice man at all. Quite a horrid man, actually. And police have also just received news that a body has been found. And this body was identified as that of 22-year-old Craig Miller. Craig was found laying face down in a field on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. He had multiple gunshot wounds to the head. He was fully clothed, but for some reason didn't have his shoes. So now this investigation took on a much more sinister tone. Where was Mary Beth, and was there still time to save her? Who could have done this? And why? Well, police are still pretty set on Charlene and Gerald Gallego as their top suspects in this case, but they have no idea where they are. Officers were quickly able to get the address of Gerald Gallego's rental apartment, and so police went down there, they knocked on the door, and no answer. No one was home. But they were able to look through the windows, and on one of the shelves in Gerald Gallego's home, they saw a bunch of guns, a bunch of bullets. Now, this doesn't necessarily make them murderers, but the gun did look awfully similar to the kind of gun that would have been used to kill Craig Miller. Gerald was known to own guns and operate guns. He enjoyed guns as a hobby. And I think that was actually why he was fired from his job as a bartender after 3 months. It was because there was one particular night where they were all getting really rowdy, everyone was really drunk, and it was like a party. And then all of a sudden, Gerald Gallego pulls this gun from his pocket and just starts shooting bullets at the roof, like trying to get people gassed up. Obviously, this didn't work out the way that he wanted. He was fired. This is completely inappropriate to be shooting off this gun in the bar that you work at. And when the police heard this story as to how Gerald Gallego got fired from his job, they wanted to go down to that bar and speak with the people there. And so they did. They went and spoke with his old boss, and his boss was like, yeah, the bullets are still stuck up in the roof over there. So these police officers went up to the roof, dislodged these bullets, sent them to the lab for testing, and they were found to be the same bullets that killed Craig Miller. So now they were pretty sure that it had to be Charlene and Gerald Gallego that did something to Craig and Mary Beth. But what? They just couldn't see the connections between these two couples. They couldn't understand how or why this had happened. Charlene's blue car was found later that evening abandoned in a car park. Obviously, police still don't know where Charlene and Gerald are, but now they've found the car and they're nowhere to be found. So police quickly theorised that the couple probably got on a Greyhound bus and they were probably headed across America right now. So police are feeling a little bit demotivated right now, because if this is true, if they've got on a Greyhound bus and just headed across America, this meant that it was going to be so hard to find them. But in a very lucky turn of events, that next morning, they actually made contact with Charlene Gallego. Well, no, they didn't. She made contact with her father. She called him and said that she'd run out of money and she really needed him to wire over $500 for her. And so he did, no questions asked. That was his daughter. He was willing to do whatever for her. He didn't ask her whereabouts or anything. I think he definitely should have worked with police on this. But anyway, he just sent her the $500. And then a couple of days later, he got another call from Charlene saying that she'd run out of that $500 and she desperately needed another $500. She told her father that they were really far away. I don't know where they'd traveled to, but it was pretty far away from Sacramento, and she wanted $500 to be able to get back home to Sacramento. And right now, Charles is on the phone to his daughter Charlene, and he's listening to all this, and as much as he wants to help his daughter, he knows that he has to do the right thing here. He knew that he could not keep protecting his daughter like this, because he had a feeling that she was responsible for something bad here. He didn't know what she'd done. He hoped that she hadn't done anything, but right now the situation was looking very suspicious, and he didn't want to be protecting his daughter like this anymore. And so Charles called the FBI and told them that his daughter was asking for more money over the phone. So the police decided to work with Charles on this. They told him, yeah, okay, send her money, but send it to a very particular place, because if they could do that, then police would be able to intercept at that particular place. It was almost like they could lure Charlene and Gerald to a particular place to be able to catch them. So that's exactly what they did. Charles decided to send the money to a particular office that was kind of in the area where Charlene and Gerald said that they were. So then when Charlene and Gerald went to go and pick up that money, police could be there waiting for them. And this plan went perfectly. Of course, Charlene and Gerald turned up just when they were supposed to. Officers were able to tackle them, arrest them, handcuff them, and bring them back to Sacramento. And it was as the two of them were being transported back to Sacramento that the police received another phone call. And this was the phone call that they never wanted to get, but they kind of thought that it was coming. And that was that Mary Beth Sowers' body had been found. She was found laying in a field with her wrists tied behind her back, her ankles tied together, and it was very clear that she had been shot to death. Multiple gunshot wounds to the head. Her autopsy also revealed that she had been brutally, violently raped as part of this attack as well. Just a side note here before we continue talking about the case, I thought this was a kind of nice way to leave Craig Miller's and Mary Beth's stories, and that is that the two of them are buried next to each other in adjoining plots in the graveyard, so at least they're back together now. So now that Mary Beth's body had been found, this was officially a double murder. This case kept growing in severity literally by the day. And it seemed that the perpetrators, the murderers, were a married couple where the wife is 8 months pregnant. No one could believe this. This seemed like such an unbelievable story. On January 17th, 1981, Charlene finally had her baby in the prison's hospital. She gave birth to a baby boy named Gerald Armand Gallego Jr., and that baby was instantly taken off her. I don't think she had it for more than a day. The baby was taken to live with Charlene's parents because, of course, they had more than enough money to be able to care for a child. Charlene's team had tried to get her let out on bail to go and have her baby in a normal hospital, but due to the severity of her crimes, of course, that bail hadn't been granted. And it was when this baby was taken away from her that Charlene had this realization. It suddenly dawned on her that all of this was very real. Like, she was finally realizing the gravity of what she'd done and how much it's going to ruin her life. I mean, she just had her baby taken away from her, and she's probably never going to really see that baby again now. She knew that she had to find a way to beat this case, or at least give it her best shot, because she wanted a chance to be out of prison and with her baby son. So in an attempt to do this, Charlene decided to fire her whole legal team and hire on 2 brand new lawyers. When Charlene first met her 2 new lawyers, the first thing she said to them was, well, how are you going to get me out of this mess? And the lawyers turned to her and said, well, what information do you have that can get you out of this mess? So Charlene turned to them and proceeded to tell them, well, we're not just talking about 2 kidnappings and murders here. Try 10. Charlene sat there and admitted to her 2 lawyers that her and her husband, Gerald Gallego, had committed 10 kidnappings and murders. Charlene thought that by doing this, she might potentially get a lighter sentence. Her husband would likely get the death penalty, but, you know, if she gave evidence against him, then she had a chance of getting out of jail while her son was still alive. So she sat there with her lawyers and told them everything. She started from the very beginning, their very first victim. It was September of 1978 when things started to get serious. Gerald Gallego was talking about this fantasy of owning sex slaves more and more, and over time, Charlene was realizing how real of a fantasy this was for him. Like I said, at first she just tried to dismiss it as though maybe he just had a thing for younger, submissive girls. But now she was realizing, no, he wants to physically own a sex slave, a woman that exists purely to gratify him sexually. And it was very clear that Charlene was just not able to fulfill that fantasy for him, you know, on her own. He didn't want a consensual role play fantasy. He wanted an actual sex slave that is actually terrified for her life around him. And so one day, Gerald turned to Charlene and told her that he had a plan and that he wanted her help on this one. He said that he was ready to take his first sex slave, and he was going to need Charlene's help because no girl was ever just going to get in a car with a 30-something-year-old man. Certainly not the kind of girls that Gerald Gallego wanted. The teenage girls, the barely even adult girls. Some of them were not even adults. And that's where Charlene came in, because she had a very trustworthy female presence. Other women feel comfortable around other women. And of course, a teenage girl would be more likely to go back to a car with Charlene, who is what, like 21, 22, than they would be willing to go back to a car with 30-something-year-old Gerald. So that was going to be Charlene's job. Her job was to lure these girls in, to lie to them, to tell them that she had something back for them at the car and bring them over to the car so that Gerald could then swoop in and take his own sex slave. On September 11th, 1978, that plan was put into action when the Gallegos decided to go to the local mall and find their very first victim. And there they spotted 2 teenage girls, 17-year-old Rhonda Scheffler and 16-year-old Kippy Vaught. Gerald pointed over to the 2 girls as soon as they saw them, and Charlene knew what this meant. Gerald stopped the car. Charlene got out and she went and approached those two girls. She asked them if they wanted to come back over to her van and smoke weed with her. And these two girls, Rhonda and Kippy, they were excited and they just said yes. So they went back to the van with this girl, Charlene, who they thought was cool. They thought she was nice. They thought they were going to have a good time. But as soon as they got there, they were met with Gerald Gallego holding a gun to their face. He told the girls to get into the back of the van and lie face down on this dirty mattress that was in there. So they did. They did as they were told. Gerald followed in behind them and tied both their wrists behind their back with adhesive tape and tied their ankles together so that they couldn't run away. He told Charlene to go and sit in the passenger seat of the van. He then proceeded to lock the back doors of the van. He jumped in the driver's seat and they all sped away. He drove them all the way to Nevada and parked in a very isolated spot, just in the middle of a random field somewhere. He walked round to the back of the van, opened the doors, and then one by one raped each of the girls repeatedly and forced the other girl to watch as he raped her best friend. After he was done, he then grabbed a shovel that was laying next to them in the van, pointed his gun at the girls and told them to get out of the back of the van. He told Charlene to wait with the vehicle and that he wouldn't be long, and then he walked these two girls at gunpoint into the forest. About 10 minutes later, he emerged alone. Gerald put the shovel in the back of the van, told Charlene to get in the driver's seat and just drive. Charlene did as she was asked. She didn't ask any questions, although she knew what had just happened. You know, she knew that he'd just killed those two girls. 2 days after the girls disappeared, their bodies were found in this meadow. It was very clear that they'd been bludgeoned and shot to death before eventually being buried in this shallow grave. And Gerald Gallego seemed pretty satisfied with this whole experience. Actually, so satisfied, in fact, that he didn't bring up this sex slave fetish to his wife, Charlene, for like a year afterwards. He'd had enough satisfaction in that one night to last him a year. But eventually that excitement wore off and he started bringing it up again. And Charlene was thinking, here we go again. On June 24th, 1979, Gerald Gallego told his wife that he was ready for another victim and that she had to help him once again. So the two of them went out to a county fair in Reno, Nevada. They literally just went and parked the car up and watched. People watched for a while until they found some young girls that they felt were the perfect victims. And that was when Gerald Gallego spotted 14-year-old Brenda Judd and 13-year-old Sandra Colley standing on the side of the road waiting for their parents to pick them up. So Charlene walked over to the girls and told them that they could actually make some money. If they wanted to hand out flyers for her at this fair, she'd be willing to pay them for it. And these two girls were really excited. They wanted to make some money. So Charlene said, okay, I've got the flyers back in my van if you want to just come over with me. And so she walked the girls over to the van where Gerald was waiting once again. As soon as those van doors opened, Gerald was standing there with a gun pointed at these two 14 and 13-year-old girls. He ordered them, just like he did the last girls, to get inside the van. He ordered them to lay on this mattress, again, face down, so that he could tie their wrists behind their back, tie their ankles together so they can't run. But this time, he told Charlene to stay in the back of the van with them while he drove. And so she sat in between them for this whole journey, as these two girls were terrified. They must have been crying, laying face down in this dirty mattress. And Charlene's just stroking their hair, telling them that everything's gonna be okay. Meanwhile, Gerald is driving this van for hours and hours and hours. The only time they actually stopped during this drive was so that Gerald could stop at a local DIY store to go and buy a hammer and a shovel. After he came out of this shop, Gerald told Charlene to get in the driver's seat now. They were gonna swap places. He wanted to go in the back of the van with those two girls. He then ordered these two girls to undress, and as Charlene drove the van out into the middle of nowhere, Gerald proceeded to rape both of those girls repeatedly. the whole time, the whole journey. Eventually, Gerald signaled to Charlene that he was ready to get rid of the girls, and so she drove them out into the desert. As soon as they parked up, Gerald grabbed the shovel and the hammer and took one of the girls out into the desert. He told the other one to wait there with Charlene. He took the first girl out. He was gone for about 10 minutes and then he came back without her. He took the second girl out into the same location and then came back again without her. Charlene asked him what he'd done with the girls, and Gerald just turned to her and said, "They're dead. Just drive." And again, just like the last one, it seemed that this incident had really satisfied whatever weird urge was inside Gerald Gallego. Because again, he stopped mentioning the sex slave fantasy that he had. He went from mentioning it every single day in the run-up to the kidnappings and murders, and then after that, it was just like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders for about a year, and then those urges would creep back in. The next one was on April 24th, 1980. Two 17-year-old best friends named Stacey Ann Redican and Karen Chapman Twiggs were both out at a local mall. Both girls had recently just got their first ever job at a fast food restaurant. They got the jobs together and they've just got their first paycheck, and they were both so excited that they both wanted to go to the mall and spend it together. They got them together, they wanted to spend them together. So that's what they were doing that day when they arrived at the mall, but they didn't even get inside the mall because in the parking lot they were approached by Charlene Gallagher asking them if they wanted to come back to her van and smoke weed with her, and these girls accepted. But as soon as they got back to the van, those back doors burst open and out jumps Gerald Gallego holding a gun in his hand. He points it at these two girls and orders them to get in the back of the van and strip naked. As soon as they did, he didn't even drive the van away from the parking lot. He stayed in the mall parking lot, climbed in the back of the van with them and raped both girls there before finally jumping back out, jumping in the driver's seat, and then driving them out to the canyon. Once they arrived at this canyon, he did the same thing that he'd done with the last two girls. He grabbed his weapons, told one of them to come with him, went away for a few minutes, he returned without her, then took the other one away, went away for a few minutes, and then returned without her. But then, when he came back the second time, normally that was Charlene's cue to get in the van and get ready to go because he'd just killed two people, so they needed to get out of there. But he told her not to go get in the van yet. He actually wanted to show her something. He asked her to come with him for a minute because he wanted to show her what he gets up to when he goes away with these victims alone. The two of them walked for a few minutes until they reached this gravel ditch, and inside this ditch were both of the girls' dead bodies. They'd been violently bludgeoned and clearly violently raped as well. The girls' bodies were found a few days later, and one of them was actually found with no hands. This could be down to a few different reasons, and actually none of them are believed to be down to Gerald. It's not believed that he cut her hands off and took them with him. Pathologists think that it could either just be some kind of freak decomposition, maybe it had just happened in a really weird way because of the climate or whatever, or maybe her hands were eaten by wolves. Less than 2 months after these murders, Gerald was ready to go again. So at this point, this urge is coming back quicker. Before it took a full year for it to come back. Now it's taken only 2 months. He's not satisfied for very long anymore. On June 7th, 1980, 21-year-old Linda Aguilar was walking home from a shopping trip in Oregon. And as she walked down the road, a van pulled up beside her. She looked inside this van and she saw a couple, a man and a woman. And immediately this made her feel safe, that it wasn't just some old, greasy, horrible, creepy man that was coming to pull over and try and hit on her. It was a couple. It looked like they had something genuine to say to her. The guy driving asked Linda if she wanted a lift, and immediately she trusted this couple, and so she accepted and went and jumped in the back of the van, not knowing that this couple had already murdered 6 girls together. So Linda's in the back of the van. Her and Charlene are just kind of making small talk as they're driving along. Charlene at this point was 4 months pregnant, and so that was the main thing that this conversation was circulating around. Then after a few minutes, Gerald pulled over the van and pretended to be sorting something out, fixing something, I don't know. A couple of minutes went by and suddenly the back doors of this van burst open and there is Gerald Gallego holding a gun at Linda Aguilar. He climbs in the van with her and proceeds to rape her. There on the roadside. He then bound her wrists and her ankles just as he had all of his other victims. He jumped back in the driver's seat of the van and drove them out to the beach. Again, he did that thing where he walked her out into the middle of nowhere and returned to the van without her. Linda's body was found almost a month later on the beach and it was very badly decomposed. Obviously, it had been out in the heat. Although surprisingly, the autopsy could tell us quite a bit about her body. Usually when a body is badly decomposed, they can't tell much from an autopsy, but this one was preserved pretty well. Linda had been hit over the head repeatedly, savagely bludgeoned, and then strangled. Although this strangulation hadn't actually killed her, because the coroner found sand in her throat and in her lungs, which meant that she'd been alive to breathe it in. Pathologists theorised that maybe Gerald Gallego hadn't actually killed Linda. Maybe he just knocked her unconscious. Maybe when he strangled her, it had been enough to make her pass out, and maybe when her body went limp, he just thought he'd killed her. So he left her there on the ground and went back to the van, drove off thinking he'd killed another woman. But then what if she woke up when he left? It's believed that this is exactly what happened, and that when Linda woke up, she was face down in the sand, but obviously because she'd been bludgeoned so horrifically, she couldn't move. She couldn't get herself up, and it's believed that she suffocated face down in the sand. Up until this very point in the case, Linda's boyfriend had actually been prime suspect number 1 in her case. Police had believed for ages that he had killed her. He was known to be violent towards Linda. He was a very, very angry man, and so as soon as she turns up murdered, police were pretty set on him as a suspect. But it wasn't him. It was these 2 serial killers that were now on their way to claim their 8th victim. 34-year-old Virginia Michelle was a mother of 2. She had a 9-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son. She worked at the Sail Inn in Sacramento as a waitress and like a bartender. It was kind of like a pub/restaurant. And on July 17th, 1980, Virginia was working a late shift at the pub. And guess who was drinking in that same pub? Gerald and Charlene Gallego. As the night went on, Charlene noticed that Gerald was eyeing up the waitress, Virginia, and she started to panic. Charlene started to panic, thinking, oh God, this is going to happen again. He's going to make me lure her out. He's going to rape her. He's going to kill her. At 2 a.m., Virginia finished her shift at the pub. She grabbed her coat and then walked out into the parking lot. She walked over to her car and went and sat in the driver's seat. I think she was just going through her bag, sorting out her stuff, and then all of a sudden she hears a knock on the window beside her. She turns round, and there she sees Gerald Gallego pointing a gun right at her face. He told Virginia to get out of the car and come back to his van with him. And so she did exactly what she was told to do. He ordered Virginia to get into the back of the van along with Charlene. He locked the 2 of them in the back. He went and got in the driver's seat and he just drove and drove and drove. Again, Charlene was trying her best to make small talk with the victim. I don't know why she did this. I don't know if she thought it made it easier to deal with. Who knows? It might have actually made it easier to deal with. I've never been in that situation myself. At one point, Gerald Gallego mentioned as they were driving that he was going to head home. You know, he was going to take Virginia back to their apartment, and suddenly Charlene just starts pleading with him, please don't do this in our home. Don't take this girl back to our home. Gerald eventually gave in and he told Charlene that he was going to take her home. She could go inside the house and he would do what he's going to do in the back of the van parked in the driveway. Charlene was okay with this and they arrived back at the home. She went inside and Gerald went round to the back of the van. He proceeded to rape Virginia, and then when he was done, he ran back inside the house, grabbed Charlene, said it's time to go, and took her back out to the van. They started driving, and then all of a sudden, Virginia just starts screaming and crying in the back of this van. She's begging them, if you're gonna kill me, just do it. Just kill me now. And this seemed to annoy Gerald, and he just said to Charlene, oh, for God's sake, you take the wheel. So Charlene reaches over and she's got the wheel. Gerald then proceeds to turn the radio all the way up to cover Virginia's screams. Then he climbed into the back of the truck and proceeded to rape her again. And when he was done, Gerald Gallego then proceeded to strangle Virginia to death with his bare hands. He then drove her body out to just some random embankment, dragged her body up there and left her. Virginia's body wasn't actually found for like 3 months after this as well. Her body was just there for so long. Following Virginia's disappearance, Charlene and Gerald were actually called in for a questioning in relation to it, obviously because they were in the bar that she worked at on the night that she disappeared. Police were interviewing everyone that was there. They told the police that they didn't know anything, but detectives at the time weren't fully convinced. They kind of thought Gerald Gallego was a bit like, I don't know, there was something about him, something about that man. So they decided to keep their eye on him for a little while. I mean, they couldn't do anything because he wasn't officially a suspect, but they kept their eye on him. And that was when they found out that Gerald was actually selling his van. The van that he drove on the night that Virginia went missing. It's quite coincidental, is it not? That a woman goes missing near this man and then he suddenly wants to get rid of the car that he was driving at the time. Police just thought it was a bit suspicious, and so they let him sell it, and then they got in touch with the buyer and went to go and search the van once it arrived at the buyer's house. So police opened the back doors of this van, and the first thing they see is a massive blood-soaked mattress. This mattress was sent off to the lab for testing, but it was found that the blood actually wasn't Virginia's. And they didn't have a match. They didn't know whose blood this was. And for some reason, detectives on that case decided to just drop it. I don't know. I actually don't know why. Like, I'm sorry, just because it's not Virginia's blood doesn't mean you haven't just found a blood-soaked mattress. Maybe you should be looking into that. Maybe. Because it is someone's blood. Had they kept going and figured out whose blood that was, maybe this would have led to an arrest. They might have been able to catch Charlene and Gerald before they would go on to murder their 9th and 10th victims, Craig Miller and Mary Beth Sowers. On the night of that frat party that Mary Beth and Craig disappeared from, Charlene and Gerald were just out in their car once again, looking for another victim. And that was when they spotted Mary Beth walking with her boyfriend. And you can see now with these murders as well that Gerald is losing his patience. They're becoming a lot quicker in succession, from every year to now every 2 months to every 1 month. Not only that, but he also doesn't wait for Charlene to do her part in the murders anymore. He is going straight at his victims with his gun. First Virginia, and now he went over to Mary Beth and Craig Miller. He approached them in the middle of this parking lot and just immediately put his gun up at their face and just shouted, "Let's go," gestured towards this blue car that he'd parked at the side. And, of course, Mary Beth and Craig were terrified. They just did it. He ordered them to go and sit in the back of this blue car, and they did. And I think it was at this point that Gerald and Charlene actually got out of the car and went and spoke with each other a few feet away. And it was at this point that, of course, Craig's friend Andy comes and runs over to the car, jumps in the driver's seat, is laughing and joking. Charlene sees this, runs over to the car, pulls Andy out, she slaps him, she jumps in the car. Gerald sees what's happened, he's panicked as well, so he runs and jumps in the passenger side, and they speed off in this car with their 2 new hostages, Mary Beth Sowers and Craig Miller. Charlene drove as Gerald turned round and started speaking with Mary Beth and Craig. He was asking them their names. Of course, they told him. Gerald turned to Craig and asked him if he had any money. Craig said he probably only had about $10 on him. And so Gerald turned to Mary Beth and said, "What are you doing with a bum like this?" That was the end of the conversation. And then Gerald just turned to face through the front window, and it was silence in that car. Eventually, Gerald instructed Charlene to get them off the highway and get them to somewhere private. She drove them out onto this gravel road in the middle of nowhere and stopped the car. And that was when Gerald turned to her and asked her, "Do you want him?" Charlene looked at him disgusted and said, "No, I don't." And that was when Gerald ordered Craig Miller to get out of the car. Once the two men were outside, Craig started pleading with him to just let Mary Beth live. You know, just make sure that she was okay. Just take her home. Just make sure she was safe. And Gerald just looked at Craig and laughed and said, "There's no chance of that happening." Gerald then pointed in a direction and told Craig to walk. He barely let him take 2 steps before he raised the gun and shot him in the back of the head in point-blank range. Gerald then went and jumped back in the car, left Craig Miller's body laying on the ground, and told Charlene to drive them back to their apartment. And she did. As soon as they got there, Gerald dragged Mary Beth into the bathroom where he proceeded to rape her multiple times over and over for the rest of the night. And as this was happening for hours, Charlene Gallego goes and lays on the couch and just has a nap. She can hear the whole thing. She can hear Mary Beth's screams from the bathroom. She's terrified, and Charlene is just having a rest. After a few hours of this, Gerald then dragged Mary Beth out of the bathroom and into the living room, and that was when Charlene saw her face and that terrified look on her face. Gerald told both the girls that they were getting back in the car, so they all got in the van and started driving. They drove out into the middle of nowhere in Nevada. Gerald stopped the van, went and grabbed Mary Beth and dragged her out into this field. Once they were there, he ordered her to lay face down on the ground, and he proceeded to shoot her multiple times in the back of the head. Charlene remembered Gerald returning to the car, smiling. He then jumped in and drove them back to their apartment where he cleaned up the crime scene. So now, Charlene Gallagher has told the police everything about every single murder that she has been a part of. And now it's time for Charlene and Gerald to go to trial. Charlene Gallagher pled guilty to the following charges: 2 counts of first-degree murder for Craig Miller and Mary Beth Sowers, and 2 counts of second-degree murder for Stacey Ann Redican and Karen Chapman Twiggs. She was found guilty of all of the above, and she was sentenced to 16 years and 8 months in prison without the possibility of parole. She was very cooperative with police officers throughout the whole investigation, throughout the whole trial process as well. She even led police out to the burial sites of most of these girls. Without Charlene, they wouldn't have had any of the a lot of the girls' bodies. And that is why her sentence was so low at just 16 years. Even though she'd had quite a significant part in these murders, she had also helped to give so much evidence to the case. Meanwhile, Gerald's trial was about to begin, and in one last attempt to cause some mayhem, Gerald decided to fire his entire legal team and represent himself. Be his own lawyer. So the trial began, and of course most of the trial centered around Charlene Gallagher. She was going to stand there and give a testimony about the kind of man her husband was. She was going to tell all the different stories about how he'd killed and lured in each different girl. She told the courts that her husband was mentally and physically abusive, and the reason that he had got her to help him with these kidnappings and rapes and murders was to satisfy some kind of twisted sexual fantasy that he had about wanting to own a sex slave. She told the court that she was very afraid of her husband. He was a very violent man. He would beat her often, and she felt that if she didn't join in and do what he asked, then she would be beaten. But she said that ultimately the reason that she did everything that she did throughout this case, throughout all of these murders, was actually just because she loved Gerald Gallagher. She said that she would do anything for him and didn't have to be told what to do. So she's basically standing there in court and said, yeah, he didn't even need to tell me to help murder these girls. I would have done it anyway without being asked, just because I love him. I don't know, this woman has very much confused me throughout this case. One minute she seems disgusted in what her husband is doing, and then the next minute she seems perfectly compliant, even willing to help him, like just falling asleep on the sofa while he raped a woman for hours in the bathroom. Like, I don't know what I think about her. There is always the possibility that she could have been acting under duress. I mean, her husband was violent. He did beat her. So at the same time, maybe she was just scared to not do the things that he said, you know? So Charlene sat and said all of this in court. And then the next day, Gerald gets up, because of course, remember, he is his own lawyer, and he has to cross-examine his own wife. And his tactic was to undermine her credibility, make her look like an idiot. He wanted to get up there and make her look like some sort of unstable drug addict so that the courts wouldn't trust her account. He was trying and trying and trying, but it was kind of hard to discredit her because her stories seemed so real, obviously, because they were. But he was desperately trying to pull out all her dirty laundry, saying that she takes these drugs all the time and she's always in that club doing these drugs with these people. Like, he's really almost humiliating this girl in front of the court. He was getting very childish and very desperate. Like, he was even bringing up, like, her marital affairs, like that she'd slept with women. He even brought up the fact that she'd been having a relationship with a woman in prison, that she'd been having this lesbian affair in prison. And at this point, the judge was like, right, that's enough. It was like the jury were watching, like, a live, petty relationship argument. It was no professional cross-examination by any means. It was actually just laughable, the whole thing. And in his closing statement, and this is just the cherry on top, this is Gerald Gallego to a T, he said, "I'm not bragging, but if I've had problems with girls, it's not because I haven't had enough. It's because I've had too many." In what world is that appropriate in court? I suppose that tells you everything you need to know about what kind of man Gerald is. After just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury came back and found Gerald Gallego guilty of all charges, and the judge sentenced him to death. In fact, Gerald Gallego is one of very few prisoners in America to actually be sentenced to death twice. He had separate trials for some of his murders because they were pinned to him at different times, like in different years. So they would just have the trial as and when. So he was getting sentenced to death for these 2 murders and then sentenced to death for these 2 and then these 2. So he had multiple death sentences. And Gerald was on death row for over 20 years. And he never actually made it to his execution date. He actually died of rectal cancer at the age of 56 on July 18th, 2002. Charlene Gallagher was released from prison in 1997 at the age of 40. She has completely changed her name. She's remarried. She has completely just moved on with her life past Gerald Gallagher, past the murders. I believe she's living just a very normal life now. She's just out there somewhere. And Charlene actually refers to herself as a victim of Gerald Gallagher's. She said, "There were victims who died and there were victims who lived. It's taken me a hell of a long time to realise I'm one of the ones who lived." And I'm really interested to hear your comments on this one. What do you guys think of Charlene Gallagher? Because on one hand, she was very much involved in this. She was very much complacent in this. But also on another hand, I do understand that she is a victim of Gerald Gallagher. She was abused by him. And that probably did factor into why she did what she did. But also at the same time, she did lure in children to be murdered, so. Thanks again to Magellan TV for sponsoring this video. Remember, you can get a month free trial if you go through the link down below in the description of this video. A huge thank you to all of my channel members for supporting me and helping decide the cases that I cover, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can click the link to do so in the description, or you can click the join button if you're on a desktop. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up. If you want to subscribe, I post true crime content like this all the time. You can click that link right there. If you want to subscribe to my second channel, there's a link right there. And if you want to watch another true crime video, there's a playlist on screen right now. Bye!